Hello, my name is Ken Kinter. I'm an assistant professor at Rutgers University, and the purpose of this presentation is to discuss process, otherwise known as behavioral addictions. There's another presentation on substance abuse, more specific to those, if you want to watch that one first or after this one. So before I get started, I just want to give some credit where credit is due. I work in something called the State Hospital Psychiatric Rehabilitation Initiative, or SPRI, and that is an affiliation between Rutgers University and the State Psychiatric Hospitals of New Jersey. The purpose is to improve the quality of care and working conditions in those hospitals. And none of this would be possible, neither these videos nor that work would be possible without the financial and other support of the New Jersey Department of Health. So we just wanted to acknowledge their contributions to this. As I mentioned, this is not specifically about addictions or substance use, but we will be talking about substance use disorders to differentiate them from the process or behavioral addictions. So we're going to talk about different types of process addictions, not all of them, but some of the more common ones. We're going to discuss the relationship between trauma, mental illness, and addictions. We're going to talk about the phenomenon of cross addiction, some of the similarities and differences between substance addictions and process addictions, as well as providing some implications for treatment, inpatient, outpatient, and self-help or 12-step style resources. So the substance abuse and addictive disorders, this is right out of the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, where that's sort of the, pardon the term, Bible for the reference material for all mental illnesses. So here are some of the areas about that: a cluster of cognitive, behavioral, and physiological symptoms, pathological pattern of behavior. In addition, there's also social and spiritual aspects to these disorders. And currently, and really want to stress this, the DSM acknowledges substance use disorders and pathological gambling. Most of these other ones we're talking about are either areas of interest or they're not included in the book yet, despite the fact that they are out there and have inpatient treatment facilities and units for them. And my favorite definition of addictions came from the CADC, who simply said the definition is, it hurts you, but you keep doing it anyway. And I think that sort of captures it pretty neatly. So you are going to be seeing these a lot during this presentation, this list of items. So in order to make the diagnosis of an addiction, you have this sort of downward spiral of phenomena going on, and you're going to be hearing about them in relation to each of the process addictions we're going to be talking about today. So some of these things are a person increasing the amount of what they're doing, trying to stop and being unsuccessful, people spending lots of time either obtaining, using, or recovering. In fact, part of that downward spiral is more and more of that person's life becomes this never-ending process of obtaining the thing, using the thing, and recuperating from the thing. And eventually that becomes all of life, and everything else gets pushed out. Cravings, a strong desire to engage in this behavior or to get this substance. And number 5 and number 7 are italicized because those are some really major points for me. Diagnosing an addiction is very often not about how much or how often, but these two big things: failure to fulfill obligations due to use and activities given up due to use. This is that phenomenon that differentiates, I think, people that are addicted from non-addicts, and that is that the thing starts taking the place of other things. And it starts with peripheral things that aren't that important, move into more important things like someone's job, someone's marriage, someone's children. All of those things ultimately get replaced. We also have continued use despite persistent, recurrent, and increasing problems. Use of situations that could be dangerous. In fact, the dangerous factor tends to increase, whether that dangerousness is someone's physical safety or medical problems or their legal status. Continued use despite increasing physical and psychological problems. And then these pretty common phenomena you've probably heard of before: tolerance and withdrawal. So tolerance, it takes more to get the same result. Think about somebody who gambles. They can't gamble on a penny machine after they've been throwing hundreds of dollars around. It just doesn't have that same kick to it. And then withdrawals, which is the psychological and sometimes physical impact of being without a thing, that thing that person has gotten very used to. So sorry, I couldn't resist, had to put Nancy Reagan and just say no up there. So just referring to the different classes of substance, this comes from the DSM. Here are the different classifications, and this classification list will only grow as time goes on. Alcohol, caffeine, cannabis, hallucinogens, which include PCP and LSD, although cannabis itself is also a mild hallucinogen. Inhalants such as nitrous oxide or people who have paint. Opioids, which includes heroin and also OxyContin and a lot of those opiate-based painkillers. Sedative, hypnotic, or anxiolytics, say, for example, things like Xanax and Klonopin that are very common. Stimulants like cocaine and methamphetamine, tobacco, and then the other and unknown. Club drugs, designer drugs, and there's always new things coming down the pipe. So now the difference between substance use disorders and these process addictions is that you don't actually need a substance. Sometimes the addiction is more about a particular behavior or a ritual, or repeating that behavior over and over again. If you think about the trance-like state of someone on a slot machine. The role of technology, because now all of these things have come home to the internet. So just like people have used technology with substance use disorders, I think process disorders have benefited, if you want to use that word, even more from technology, where you can gamble your life away from your office or from your car, or engage in your addiction of choice without having to go anywhere. Process addictions can be much more invisible. Might be hard to drink yourself to death in the office, but you can bankrupt yourself gambling pretty quickly, or shop yourself into oblivion without anyone noticing, or without any of those signs that you see with drugs and alcohol, where there's a sort of physical decompensation that happens along with it. Another challenge with the process addictions is that abstinence may not be possible, nor even desirable. So in the case of things like shopping or sex, the goal is that this person isn't going to stop shopping or stop sex altogether. So we have to separate the healthy from the unhealthy use, emphasize the healthy behaviors, and then while disconnecting them from the unhealthy behaviors. Again, think about eating disorders or food addiction in that perspective. Obviously, not eating isn't the solution there. So this is not an exhaustive list of all the types of process addictions, but it's covering some of the ground. We see gambling, internet gaming, sex and love addiction, food addiction, compulsive shopping or buying. If I were going to throw another one on here, it would be screen addiction, where people go from their video game to their phone, to their computer, to their tablet. Maybe that might actually be one on its own at some point. So now the first issue with gambling is that gambling is acknowledged as an addiction by the DSM. It is the only process addiction so designated. So here are the categories here. Again, will look very similar to what we saw before. Increasing amounts of money. The person becomes restless or irritable. Again, those are the withdrawals, when they're trying to cut down or stop gambling. They've repeatedly tried to stop and failed. There's a preoccupation. They're always thinking about it. Any sporting event that's on or anything that's happening, it's going on all the time. The person engages in the behavior to change their mood, when feeling distressed. And that's that vicious cycle, because gambling causes stress, which gambling is then used to medicate, and then you're right back again. One specific phenomenon that is pretty specific to gambling, it's that idea of chasing your losses. Like, I'm going to get my money back. As soon as you hear somebody say that they're going to get their money, I lost yesterday, but I'm going to get it back today. That is a problem. That you hear that type of language, there's definitely something going on. The person lies to conceal the degree to which this has gone. It has cost them relationships, jobs, or other types of opportunities. Again, that's that role displacement that we were talking about before. When is something an addiction? When it starts to bump other things out of a person's life, particularly things that person held important. And then here's another trick that goes specifically with gambling: relies on others to provide money. And this is where the dangerousness comes in. Where are you getting that money from? I remember admitting somebody to an inpatient unit because they had because of their gambling losses, and they were afraid that someone was going to hurt them. So they came to the ER, said they were suicidal, so that they would become admitted with the idea that they would be physically safe. So the internet gaming disorder is listed as a condition for further study in the DSM, and is showing signs of being accepted as a formal process addiction. And of course, there are inpatient units for this already, as well as some other treatment, which we'll talk about. You're going to see some of the same categories here. I highlighted them: preoccupation, withdrawals when not engaging in gaming. It's almost like everything else seems like an irritant. Like my life is really about gaming, and all this other stuff is things I have to tolerate, like a job or my family or other responsibilities. The tolerance takes more and more time to scratch that itch. It's eventually insatiable. Inability to reduce despite trying. E, here we go with the role displacement, giving up on other activities. Continuing to game despite increasing problems. The more challenges that it creates, almost the more desire the person has to game. Deceiving or lying to family members about the time playing. Using it to change mood. And also here come the losses to that person's life, but continuing going. I met someone who almost died from online gaming disorder. He didn't eat or drink. He played for about 24 hours and then got up and fell down the stairs and almost broke his neck. And he ended up going to the emergency room where his significant other bottom lined him and said, "You are getting help or you are getting out." And that actually helped turn him around, which is very nice. So sex and love addiction, this is not mentioned in the DSM-5. If you are more interested in this, I would refer you to the work of Patrick Carnes, C-A-R-N-E-S. He has provided his own classifications, as has Stephanie Carnes, about what sex and love addiction, what these would look like, these categories would look like in the DSM. Again, it's going to look very familiar. Preoccupation with sexual acting out. This is important to differentiate. Sexual acting out, someone may have I don't want to use the word normal, but an average sex life. They may have a partner who they engage in sexual behavior with, but then they have this other sort of double life thing that may involve things like prostitutes, go-go bars, or online activity, or pornography, those sorts of things. So there's this healthy and this unhealthy sex life that are mingled together. I also want to differentiate between sex and love addiction. Some people are both, some people are one or the other. Sex addiction is an addiction to specific sexual behaviors. Again, these sexual acting out behaviors. Love addiction may not necessarily involve sex. It may just involve getting from one relationship to another, and these relationships aren't particularly healthy. It overlaps a lot more with what people refer to as codependency. So it has more to do with that. And of course, people can be both. So you'll see the rest of this list of categories pretty similar. Preoccupation, withdrawal, tolerance, not able to stop, role displacement, giving up the other activities, increasing problems, particularly legal problems. And let's think about the stigma that this addiction carries, in terms of Megan's Law, in terms of its, loss of freedom, lying or deceiving family members or others, use of sex to relieve negative moods, and of course, the risks of losing a job, specifically one's freedom. This one leads to incarceration quite a bit, and not just any incarceration, but in dangerous incarceration. People that have sexual offenses are at the lowest rung in the criminal justice system. And of course, they almost have their own track in the criminal justice system in terms of indefinite probation. So food addiction, and this is not to be confused necessarily with eating disorders. And what I did was I took the substance dependence criteria from the DSM-5 and sort of superimposed food over top of it, so you would see what it looks like. Again, food addiction is not recognized in the DSM-5, but let's look at those same categories here. Tolerance, withdrawal, using larger amounts over a longer period of time, persistent unsuccessful efforts to cut down, increased time in obtaining, using, recovering, role displacement, continuing use despite increasing problems. And I would also add lying about it. The whole idea of food addiction, to maintain an addiction, lying is necessary. It's hard to be an honest active addict. Like either the honesty or the active addiction has to go. So did the same thing here with compulsive shopping or buying. I just took the criteria for substance dependence from the DSM and superimposed it just so you get an idea what it looks like. We're talking about an addiction when these things are happening: tolerance, withdrawal, larger amounts. And again, you can see the rest of it. There was an example that I remember about a person who wanted to have a baby with her husband. However, there were whole rooms in the house full of things that this person had bought and weren't using. So there really wasn't the physical space for there to be a baby involved until this got taken care of. And eventually she realized this was a medicating type of behavior. So here's the chicken and the egg, the time-honored question: which came first? Did the addiction come first? Did the mental illness come first? The mental illness come first? The addiction come first? We've been fighting about this since I got in the field 30 years ago. And fortunately, we seem to have made some progress on it. Now, the first answer to this question was that the mental illness comes first. There's this feeling of depression, of anxiety, and the addiction is an attempt to medicate that. So that's why you have to keep going back to it. And of course, the addiction will never completely make the problem go away. So you have to keep coming back. It takes more and more, and that's how that vicious cycle starts. Now, as we've started to look at things through a trauma-informed lens, we realize there's another layer to it altogether. So when you see someone, very often you're seeing the addiction first, then you stabilize the addiction, and then you start to see the mental illness. In fact, when that person is new in recovery and they start to get some clean time away from their behavior, very often these symptoms of mental illness will become worse because now you haven't medicated the thing anymore. So here it comes. So then you very often have to treat that as well. And then there's an even deeper level. Almost every addict that I've ever worked with, and I've been working with them for over 30 years, almost all of them have some sort of background of trauma. So the trauma fuels the mental illness, which fuels the addiction. So when you can finally get down into that bottommost layer of where the trauma is, and you can provide some relief for the trauma, that's when you'll start to see the benefits in these other domains. So it's a terrible thing to tell someone who's in early recovery. When they finally get to stop their acting out behaviors, they start to think that the job is nearly over, when in reality, the work is just beginning. So that's the bad news. So cross addiction is when someone goes from one addiction to another. And usually what they're trying to do is get the same effect from something else. This one thing has become problematic for me. I'm drinking too much. My liver's starting to become problematic. So now I'm going to switch over to weed. Someone gets very involved in cocaine for a while, and then they get arrested a few times. So they find they get that same rush from gambling. So if you've been to the Jersey Shore, you know whack-a-mole. These little moles pop up through the holes and you hit them with the hammer. But there's always a mole coming up somewhere else. And sometimes it comes back in the same spot where it was. Sometimes it comes up somewhere else, but the moles always come back. And this speaks to this idea that behind the addiction is the addict. And the addict is that thing that causes someone to do something over and over again beyond, what people would consider healthy or whatever most people would do. So you kind of see here how it's sort of interchangeable. Usually they're looking for a similarity of effect. It's weird to go from cocaine to weed because their effect is different, but from cocaine to gambling, much more similar. So as far as the treatment side of things goes, as we mentioned, even though these things aren't in the DSM, there are inpatient facilities for these things, for gaming, for sex addiction, for these things that we were just talking about. When it comes to outpatient therapy, just like with inpatient therapy, the general practitioner isn't going to be able to handle this. There really should be specialized units for treatment. And when you're looking for someone who treats somebody on the outside, you want to make sure that they have a specialty in this area. For example, in addictions, it's very common for a therapist to advocate for something called a disclosure, where a person tells their loved ones about the details of their addiction. In 12 steps, we call it a step 1. So the problem is, say, with something like sex addiction, that disclosure, there's a lot going on with that disclosure, and you don't want to just let that go all at once. There may be venereal diseases involved. There may be other people involved. And you don't just want to open Pandora's box without doing a lot of advanced footwork. So your average therapist is not well trained in these things. So that is a concern. Also in outpatient, there are medications that are being used to treat naltrexone, particularly, that they use to treat the cravings. I'm not a big fan of just doing medication treatment solo. It doesn't, that whack-a-mole phenomenon, it doesn't really take care of the addiction per se or any of that stuff underneath. There's much more to recovery than abstinence, which is just being clean of a substance or a process. The recovery is all that work underneath that really is essential to a long-term recovery. There's also 12-step groups, which we'll talk about later. I've gotten a bunch of them listed at the end here. This provides a lot of support. It takes one to know one, so that part's helpful. They do their step work and their recovery work together. They're positive role models. They've shared the stressors. They've shared the stories. And these people very often form a safety net for each other. That's the person that you can call or you can text when you're in that bad situation. It's somebody who's been there. So as we mentioned before, abstinence is not always a good idea, and it's not always possible. Someone who has a sex addiction is not going to be celibate for the rest of their life. Someone who's a compulsive shopper still needs to shop to live. So how do you separate the healthy from the unhealthy behaviors when they may look very similar? So there are many tools for this, but one I just wanted to explain to you briefly is something called the 3 circles. And that's where you divide all of that person's behavior into 3 domains. The outer circle are the healthy behaviors, both those that have to do with the addiction and those that don't. And you can kind of see some examples of that right here with, on the right side here, we have an example for a recovering gambler. So the outer circle has some gambling specific behaviors, but many not. In the middle circle, you have the risky behaviors as well as internal and external triggers. So you see some of those in here as well. Some of those are gambling related, some of those are related to other addictions, and some of them are related to other things. So these are also comprised, middle circle is also comprised of, say, internal triggers like states of mind. In Alcoholics Anonymous, they refer to something called HALT, hungry, angry, lonely, tired. People are more susceptible to drinking when they're hungry, angry, lonely, and tired. In some of the process addictions, they talk about HALT BS, because bored and stressed belong. If you're bored or if you're stressed, you're infinitely more likely to relapse on anything. So that's where HALT BS comes from. You may also have external triggers. External triggers are things from outside that make you more likely to use. Compulsive gamblers probably see tons of gambling commercials on TV now that it's been legalized. And that's a trigger. How many gambling commercials can you see without feeling like you have to indulge in the behavior? I've known people that were 30 years sober from alcohol who they sweat when they start to see beer commercials. So that pull is very strong. Then you have the inner circle behaviors. These are what we call the bottom line behaviors. And when people talk about how long they've been clean, these are the behaviors they're talking about being clean from. And on this example, you have lotto tickets, playing slots, and betting on horses. And then you also want to watch again for that cross addiction, because we can see that alcohol has some potential here to become a cross addiction. It's already involved. So in summary, and I know we covered a lot of ground here fast, an addiction is an addiction is an addiction, but each one has little specific pieces about it, which really presses for the need for specialized treatment. Process, otherwise known as behavioral addictions, do not require a substance. It could be literally a process or a recurrent behavior. We mentioned some of the common ones, and of course, there's many more. More people than not have more than one addiction and maybe a mix of process or substance. It seems to be about that end result, that end effect. The DSM recognizes gambling, doesn't recognize these others, but they're in the process. Process addictions are different to treat than substance addictions, specifically in the area possibly of abstinence. It may not be a desirable or possible option. There are inpatient services, outpatient services, and 12-step programs for each of these, which we're going to show some of those in a minute. Bottom line is treatment is out there. And like with any other addiction or any other mental illness, recovery is possible. So on here, you see a list of a few of the 12 steps, 12-step groups that go along with the process addictions that I was talking about. Some of these, and I also threw in some of the, the standard Alcoholics Anonymous. That's the one that all the rest of these sort of spun off from. You see a few different ones here, and each of them have sort of an assessment tool. So if you or a loved one might fit the category for this, they have a way of being able to sort of evaluate and assess yourself to determine if this is something that you could use some benefit from. And I encourage you to follow up with those. They also have open meetings, both online and in person. So you can attend an open meeting and get some information about it without having to commit to having the addiction yourself. Here are some of the resources that I got the information from that I was talking about. This first one by Patrick Carnes is a non-addiction specific 12-step book. So regardless of what someone's addiction is, this is a way of going through the steps. I find that book is very, very helpful. And also the bottom line on here, this is the website where all of our other videos are, including the other substance abuse addiction video I was talking about. To date, we have over 20 videos on that site about a variety of mental health topics. I encourage you to check them out. And also, if you have any feedback about this video or other topics you'd like us to take on, please feel free to either comment on this video or on any of the other ones. We'd love to have your ideas. So thank you for your time and your attention, and hope to see you again soon. Take care.